For most of human existence, the world was not divided by borders. There were no maps, no property titles, no centers of power. There was movement. For tens of thousands of years, human beings lived in constant motion, adjusting their steps to the rhythm of the planet. They followed the seasons, the flow of water, the migration of animals. When resources were exhausted in one place, they moved on. There was no idea of staying. The landscape was not something to be conquered, but something to be understood. These groups were not primitive versions of us. Biologically, they were fully human. They thought, felt, communicated, and cooperated with the same complexity as any person today. The difference was not in mental capacity, but in how they related to the environment and to one another. Life did not revolve around accumulation, but around adaptation. There was no concept of growth. There was only continuity. This way of life deeply shaped human social structure. Small groups, usually made up of just a few dozen individuals, maintained direct social bonds. Everyone knew one another. Decisions were made collectively, not through force, but through tacit agreement. Anyone who tried to place themselves above the others met immediate resistance, not through direct confrontation, but through the simplest solution possible. The group would move away. In a world without walls and without fixed property, power had little room to take root. Survival depended on an intimate knowledge of the land, knowing when fruits ripened, where herds crossed, how to read subtle signs in the landscape. This knowledge was passed down from generation to generation, not through writing or institutions, but through shared experience. Throughout this long period, humanity left few permanent marks. There were no cities, no mines carved into the earth, no monuments raised. Environmental impact was minimal. Human beings existed as just one element within a much larger ecological web. But this balance was not only cultural, it was reinforced by the planet's climate itself. For tens of thousands of years, Earth existed under unstable conditions. Glaciers advanced and retreated, making the environment unpredictable. Temperatures fluctuated dramatically. Landscapes changed on timescales too short to allow permanent settlement. Planting something with the expectation of harvesting months later was, in most cases, an unnecessary risk. Climatic instability kept humans on the move. And then, slowly, the planet changed. Around 12,000 years ago, the end of the last great glaciation marked the beginning of a new geological period, the Holocene. For the first time since our species existed, the climate became relatively stable. Seasons began to follow more predictable patterns. Average temperatures rose. Rainfall became more regular in certain regions. This stability did not appear evenly across the globe. It created pockets of abundance. In a broad zone stretching from the Levant to Mesopotamia, natural conditions favored the spontaneous growth of calorie-rich grasses that were easy to harvest. Wild grains grew in unusually dense clusters. Migratory animals crossed valleys with predictable regularity. For the first time, the energy gained from gathering food far exceeded the energy required to obtain it. The logic of survival changed. Human groups living in these regions no longer needed to travel vast distances to feed themselves. Year after year, the same territory offered sufficient resources. Mobility, once essential, began to become optional. And this is where the first silent rupture occurred. These communities did not begin by planting. They began by staying. Homes became more durable. Stone structures replaced temporary shelters. Heavy objects, grinding stones, mortars, storage pits, became part of daily life. Tools that could not be carried over long distances signaled something new, the intention to remain. With permanence came a profound shift in how time was perceived. Before, the future was immediate. Now it extended forward. Food could be stored, land could be tied to memory. The dead began to be buried near homes, creating symbolic links between family, territory, and ancestry. Land was no longer just space, it became place. This new way of living brought inevitable biological consequences. In nomadic groups, the number of children was limited by the need to move. A child had to be carried for years. Births were naturally spaced far apart. In fixed communities, this limitation disappeared. The population grew. Small groups became villages. Local consumption increased. Pressure on nearby resources became constant. What had once regenerated naturally began to be exploited faster than it could recover. And then, the environment responded. Around 10,800 BC, the climate underwent an abrupt reversal. Temperatures dropped rapidly across much of the northern hemisphere. Rainfall became irregular. Ecosystems that had once been stable began to collapse. For communities now dependent on fixed territories, this shift represented an existential threat. Faced with this crisis, there were only two options. The first was to abandon everything, dismantle villages, disperse populations, return to a fully nomadic way of life. But the surrounding environment could no longer support that many people living by hunting and gathering. This choice meant hunger, conflict, and a drastic population decline. The second option was intervention. It was in this context that agriculture emerged, not as a vision of progress, but as a desperate response to environmental pressure. Communities began protecting certain plants, removing competitors, selecting more productive seeds, and controlling water. The landscape started to be intentionally modified. This simple act marked an irreversible change. From that moment on, humans stopped merely adapting to the world. They began shaping it. By selecting and replanting crops, people slowly altered plant biology itself. Grains that once dispersed naturally became dependent on human hands to reproduce. Nature and society became interdependent. But this new dependence came at a cost. Diets became more restricted. Nutritional diversity declined. Physical labor increased. Repetitive work left its mark on bones. Average health began to deteriorate, even as populations continued to grow. Success was no longer measured by individual resilience, but by the ability of the group to multiply. Humanity had crossed a threshold, and it did not yet know what that would mean. Before we continue this journey, I want to ask you a simple but important question. Where are you listening from right now? From a large city? From a place surrounded by nature? Or from somewhere in the world where history still feels visible in the landscape? Leave your answer in the comments. Your location is also part of this story. Agriculture did not transform only the landscape. It transformed human relationships. When the first groups began to depend on a specific territory to survive, something fundamental changed in the way people related to one another. In a nomadic world, conflicts had a simple solution: separation. When tensions arose, groups moved apart. Land did not belong to anyone in an exclusive sense. Space was vast, and movement was always an option. But in agricultural communities, leaving was no longer simple. A farmer invested months of labor into a single field, preparing the soil, waiting for the rains, protecting the crops. Abandoning that land meant losing not only the harvest, but future survival itself. Land became something that had to be maintained, defended, and controlled. This is how the idea of property began to emerge, not as a legal concept, but as a practical necessity. Where there had once been shared use, there was now claim. Where there had once been movement, there was now fixation. This shift profoundly altered the social balance. Mobility, which had functioned as a natural safeguard against domination, was replaced by permanence. Freedom was no longer measured by the distance one could travel, but by access to land. With this change, new tensions emerged. In growing agricultural villages, resources were no longer dispersed. They were concentrated. Grain could be stored. Animals could be kept in enclosures. Surplus production made it possible to endure difficult periods, but it also created something entirely new: targets. A full granary represented security for those who owned it, and opportunity for those who did not. The need for protection became clear. Around 8000 BC, in an oasis of the Jordan Valley, one community made a decision that would mark human history. In Jericho, its inhabitants built a monumental stone wall, accompanied by a tower rising several meters above the surrounding landscape. For a long time, archaeologists debated the purpose of this structure: flood control, ritual monument, symbolic landmark. But as evidence accumulated, one interpretation became increasingly convincing: defense. The wall did not protect people on the move. It protected stored goods. It enclosed cultivated fields, grain silos, and water sources. It was a silent declaration: this is ours. Land was no longer just sustenance. It had become territory. This transformation carried inevitable political consequences. Building walls required coordination. Maintaining defensive structures demanded continuous labor. Someone had to organize tasks, set priorities, distribute resources. Gradually, the informal organization of villages began to give way to more defined roles. The structural equality of nomadic societies began to dissolve. Not everyone had equal access to resources. Not everyone participated equally in decision-making. Those who controlled storage, defense, or the redistribution of food gained increasing influence. Authority was no longer temporary or situational. It became persistent. This change is visible in the archaeological record. For thousands of years, human burials had been relatively simple and uniform. With the rise of agricultural societies, certain graves began to stand out. Some individuals were buried with rare objects, ornaments, and materials brought from distant regions. Status had crossed beyond life and entered death. Inequality, once episodic and limited, was becoming structural. For a long time, this new way of life remained confined to regions where agriculture depended primarily on rainfall. In these areas, human effort was still partially aligned with natural cycles. But as populations grew, these regions became insufficient to sustain everyone. Pressure pushed entire communities into new territories. Some migrated into a vast lowland plain situated between two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. The region that would later be known as Mesopotamia offered a tempting promise and a constant danger. In its natural state, the landscape was hostile. Rainfall was scarce. Heat was intense. The rivers, though vital, were unpredictable. They could fertilize the land or destroy it within hours. Sudden floods swept away fields and homes with little warning. But beneath this instability lay something extraordinary: soils of incomparable fertility. Over millennia, the rivers had deposited deep layers of nutrient-rich silt. If water could be controlled, this land could produce food in quantities never before seen. It was there that humanity took another decisive step. The inhabitants of the Mesopotamian plain chose to abandon direct dependence on rainfall and adopt an artificial irrigation system. Canals were dug, dikes were built, water was diverted, stored, and distributed according to human decisions. This choice completely altered social structure. Irrigated agriculture required labor on a massive scale. No single family could dig kilometers of canals, maintain dikes, or remove accumulated sediment year after year. These tasks demanded continuous coordination, planning, and collective discipline. Survival now depended on obedience to the system. Whoever controlled the flow of water controlled life. From this point on, authority was no longer merely social or symbolic. It became administrative. Someone had to decide when canals would open, who would receive water, and in what quantity. Mistakes meant famine. Disobedience meant exclusion. Power was no longer negotiable. It became structural. Over time, this centralized management transformed the landscape itself. Southern Mesopotamia ceased to be an environment shaped primarily by nature. It became a continuous artificial system. Irrigated fields, storage centers, transport networks, and dense population hubs. The village, as the dominant form of human organization, began to prove insufficient. As surpluses increased, new forms of specialization emerged. Not everyone needed to produce food anymore. Some began to build, others to administer, others to protect. Labor became fragmented. Mutual dependence intensified. This process led to an unprecedented concentration of people. Within a few centuries, certain centers grew beyond any scale previously known. People began living permanently surrounded by thousands of strangers. Familiarity, which had sustained social cohesion in small communities, was no longer possible. Something new was required to maintain order. Institutions, fixed rules, permanent authorities, structures that transcended personal relationships. Collective life came to be mediated by abstract systems, no longer solely by direct human bonds. At this point, something fundamental had changed in the human experience. Security had increased, production had grown, but the freedom to simply leave had disappeared. Civilization was taking shape, not as a carefully planned ideal, but as the cumulative result of choices made under pressure. And it was still only beginning. As irrigated agricultural systems expanded, something quiet but profound was happening at the heart of these artificial landscapes. Growth was no longer only horizontal, spreading across more land. It was becoming vertical, socially denser, more concentrated, more complex. The village, which still retained traces of family autonomy, began to dissolve into something larger. The city was being born. In southern Mesopotamia, communities that had once organized themselves around fields and canals began to cluster permanently around administrative and religious centers. These hubs concentrated granaries, workshops, temples, and command structures. Gradually, people stopped living scattered across the land and began gathering within defined spaces. This concentration produced a deep transformation in everyday human experience. For the first time, large numbers of people lived side by side without direct kinship ties. Facial recognition, social memory, and reputation, the pillars of communal life in small groups, became insufficient. Personal trust could no longer sustain the functioning of society. Something impersonal was required. Rules that did not depend on knowing the other person. Authorities that did not need to justify every decision. Systems that functioned independently of direct human relationships. It was in this context that one of the greatest leaps in human history occurred. Around 3800 BC, one of these urban concentrations surpassed all others. Uruk was not merely a large village. It was something qualitatively different. At its height, tens of thousands of people lived within a walled area, organized into neighborhoods, connected by streets, and integrated by a centralized economy. For a species that had evolved to live in groups of only a few dozen individuals, this represented a cognitive rupture. Life in Uruk demanded new mechanisms of organization. Food no longer came directly from individual effort. Most of the population did not grow its own food. Instead, people worked on public projects, maintaining canals, building walls, or performing specialized tasks. In return, they received food. This detail marks a crucial shift. Food ceased to be something produced and consumed within the same family unit. It became compensation distributed by institutions. Labor was separated from direct subsistence. The archaeological record reveals this transformation in an almost mundane way. Millions of simple clay bowls, mass-produced, appear scattered throughout the ruins of Uruk and other contemporary cities. They were standardized containers, all the same size, designed to measure portions. These bowls were not household utensils. They were administrative tools. Each represented a ration, a fixed amount of food distributed daily to workers. The uniformity of these objects suggests a system that treated people as measurable units of production. Work had become abstract. Food had become payment. Such a system required rigorous administration. Warehouses had to record inputs and outputs. Labor needed to be accounted for. Obligations had to be defined. Human memory, limited and unreliable, was no longer sufficient to manage such complexity. A practical solution emerged. Writing was not invented to tell stories, it was invented to count things. The earliest clay tablets found in Uruk do not recount myths, battles, or genealogies. They record quantities: stored grain, delivered animals, completed workdays. Simple symbols represented goods and economic actions. Writing began as accounting. This detail reveals much about the nature of the emerging civilization. The goal was not to preserve culture, but to control resources. Recording information was a way to exercise power at a distance. Those who controlled the records controlled the system. Thus, a new social class emerged: the scribes. They were neither kings nor supreme priests. They were specialists, intermediaries between the population and the institution. Their knowledge granted them quiet authority. Those who could not read the records could not challenge them. Information became centralized. With writing, the city gained something unprecedented: institutional memory. Obligations no longer depended on recollection or negotiation. They were inscribed in clay. Production, taxes, and labor were fixed in durable symbols. Administration became impersonal, continuous, and resistant to time. But this new system also brought an inevitable consequence: the loss of autonomy. For most people, leaving the city meant losing access to food, protection, and work. City walls offered security against external threats, but they also created an economic prison. Permanence ceased to be a choice and became a condition. As cities expanded, they began to compete with one another. Disputes over water, irrigated land, and trade routes grew more frequent. Conflicts that had once been episodic and limited became organized. War ceased to be occasional. It became structural. Around 2500 BC, a new form of authority began to assert itself over the old religious centers. Military power gained prominence. Kings emerged as figures capable of offering protection in exchange for loyalty, labor, and tribute. The monopoly of force consolidated political power. With standing armies, war produced a new resource: prisoners. Unlike in nomadic societies, where captives were a burden, cities provided the conditions for confinement and the continuous exploitation of forced labor. Mesopotamian records reflect this reality. The symbol used to designate a slave combines the idea of foreigner with that of person. Domination was embedded directly in language. The great works of civilization, walls, canals, temples, were not built solely through voluntary cooperation. They were also erected through the compulsory labor of conquered populations. The city, therefore, was not only a center of production and culture, it was a mechanism of control. Meanwhile, other regions of the world developed their own versions of this process. Along the Nile, a more predictable environment favored stability. In Egypt, political and religious power merged in the figure of the pharaoh, considered divine and responsible for maintaining cosmic order. Farther east in the Indus Valley, highly organized cities emerged without clear evidence of kings or standing armies. Grid-like streets, advanced drainage systems, and architectural standardization point to a different form of organization, perhaps based on social norms or mercantile elites. In different parts of the world, distinct cultures domesticated different staple crops: rice, maize, millet, potatoes. Yet the underlying pattern repeated itself. Surplus enabled population growth. Density required coordination. Coordination produced hierarchy. Civilization was not a conscious plan. It was a convergence. Humanity was building ever more powerful systems to organize collective life. But with each layer added, those systems became harder to abandon. The city had become the center of the human world. And now, power was reaching for something even greater. As cities multiplied and grew stronger, an invisible limit began to reveal itself. Governing a single urban center was no longer enough to guarantee security, stability, or continuous access to resources. Trade routes crossed territories controlled by others. Water flowed from distant regions. Threats did not respect walls. The question was no longer how to govern a city, but how many cities could be governed at the same time. It was in this context that the logic of civilization took another leap. Around 2300 BC, in the region of Akkad, a ruler emerged who broke with the traditional model of independent city-states. He was not satisfied with controlling a single urban center surrounded by fields. His ambition was broader, to bring multiple cities under a single political authority. His name was Sargon. Unlike earlier kings, whose power was closely tied to a specific temple or city, Sargon built something new, a system of continuous territorial domination, sustained by permanent military force, centralized administration, and enforced loyalty. The empire had been born. Conquest ceased to be episodic. It became a method. Armies marched not only to plunder, but to annex. Defeated cities were not destroyed, they were absorbed. Their local rulers were replaced or subordinated. Their resources were integrated into a larger system. This model profoundly altered the nature of power. Authority no longer needed to justify itself through local tradition, ancestry, or proximity to a city's gods. It was legitimized by the ability to impose order across vast territories. Obedience was not negotiated, it was demanded. To sustain this structure, the empire expanded mechanisms that had already emerged in cities. Writing became more complex. Bureaucracy grew. Tributes were standardized. Records began to travel across long distances. The state ceased to be local. It became abstract. As a result, human experience reached a new level of distance. Most people no longer knew who made the decisions that shaped their lives. Orders came from afar, transmitted by scribes, officials, and administrators. Authority became invisible, yet constant. War also changed. Conflicts between cities gave way to prolonged military campaigns. Violence became organized on a large scale. Prisoners became an essential part of the imperial economy, absorbed as forced labor for construction, agriculture, and infrastructure maintenance. The empire consolidated something that had already been forming, the definitive separation between those who decide and those who execute. Meanwhile, in other regions of the world, different paths led to similar outcomes. In Egypt, extreme centralization produced one of the longest-lasting civilizations in history. The pharaoh concentrated political, religious, and symbolic power, presenting himself as the embodiment of universal order. In the Indus Valley, the apparent absence of warrior kings suggests an alternative form of organization, perhaps based on consensus, trade, or ritual authority. Even so, these cities depended on complex systems of coordination, standardization, and control. In China, in the Americas, and elsewhere, dense agricultural societies developed their own structures of power. Different in form, similar in function, surplus enabled specialization. Specialization required coordination. Coordination consolidated hierarchy. Civilization followed a recurring pattern. Over millennia, these systems became increasingly sophisticated. They produced art, science, engineering, and accumulated knowledge. They enabled the preservation of collective memory and the development of writing, mathematics, and technology. But the structural cost remained. Human life came to exist within systems that demanded permanence. The freedom to simply move away, so central to the experience of hunter-gatherers, became impractical. Survival came to depend on obedience to rules, taxes, labor, and institutions. Civilization did not eliminate nature. It enclosed it, measured it, and administered it. Even today, we live within this invisible architecture. Modern states, global cities, centralized economies, and complex bureaucracies are direct heirs of those first agricultural experiments. The tensions we face between security and freedom, growth and sustainability, control and autonomy, are not new. They were born when we stopped following the world and began redesigning it. Civilization gave us unprecedented collective power, but it also pulled us away from the balance we once understood intuitively. The modern world is not a break from the distant past. It is the continuation of a choice made 12,000 years ago, and we are still living inside it. Before we close, I want to make a simple invitation. If you enjoyed this journey through the origins of civilization, subscribe to the channel. This content was reconstructed with the support of artificial intelligence, combining historical research, academic analysis, and narration to recreate the past in a visual and accessible way. AI does not replace history. It helps us see it. By subscribing, you support this project and gain access to new historical reconstructions created with the same care and depth. And if this video made you reflect, leave a comment. History continues when someone chooses to look back.